Welcome everybody to the PyCon 2021 keynote of the Python Steering Council. My name is Barry Warsaw.
I'm Thomas Wouters. I'm from the Netherlands.
I'm Carol Lilling. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm from San Diego, California.
I'm Pablo Galindo. I'm from Spain, although now I live in the United Kingdom.
And I'm Brett Cannon, residing in Canada. So welcome all. Now, for those of you who happen to not quite know what the Steering Council is, we're actually going to start off with covering what that is, actually. And specifically, we are a group of 5 that are more or less in charge of trying to help keep the Python core project running. It was originally set up to help transition the project over from when Guido stepped down as our benevolent dictator for life, or BDFL. If you're curious about the exact details of this, it's all covered in PEP 13. Our general goal is to govern by consensus, not authoritarian control. So what that means is we try to help drive conversation and make sure things kind of reach a general conclusion on the Python development team itself, so that things are driven more by what the group wants and not what we happen to just want. Although on occasion, if there's no obvious consensus and we're unable to reach a consensus as an overall group, it falls on our shoulders to make the final call. We have a general goal of trying to foster the community and the core devs who are almost exclusively volunteers. So I'll cover our general goals overall from later in the slides, but in general, you can view it as we're trying to, as I said, foster the community, make the core devs be productive because they're all volunteers, and just try to make it so everyone can be productive as they can. When it comes to PEPs, which some of you may have heard of, which are Python Enhancement Proposals, which are how people present and propose new changes to the language, those come to us. And part of our seeking consensus means we actually try to delegate those decisions to domain experts when possible. But once again, if there's no one in a position that can meet that definition of expert in a good way, it falls on our shoulders to make the final call on those PEPs. So if you're happy with the PEP, you can blame us. If you aren't happy, you can still blame us. We do meet about weekly for an hour, although we obviously have work outside of that weekly meeting to try to keep everything running smoothly. As you heard earlier, there are 5 of us from around the world, 2 from America, 1 from the Netherlands, 1 from Spain via England, and myself from Canada. So we have a nice diverse international group of people. And in terms of what the 5 of us try to do, there's kind of 2 aspects to it. There's the direction for the future, where we would like things to go over the roughly 5 years is about the time frame we try to think, and what's happening directly. I'm going to cover what the direction is for the foreseeable next 5 years now, and later in the presentation, Pablo will actually be discussing more immediate next year time horizons. So currently our biggest focus is on maintenance. We're trying to make the lives easier for the volunteers of the core team. Because we don't get a lot of paid staff like some languages and communities have, we have to try to do what we can to make contributing to the project, Python specifically, as fun and engaging and accessible as possible, which is really tricky because we're trying to make it not only easier for the core developers to be productive, to be able to let code in a quality and standard that meet our needs and your needs as users, but also to make it easy for you as a occasional contributor to come in and actually provide PRs, input, bug reports, et cetera, et cetera. And all this also means we're trying to keep the stability of the project itself going. So one way you could think of this is we're trying to make sure that the project doesn't collapse on itself. And it's a balancing act. We also try to make sure that the maintainability of the infrastructure itself keeps going. We have a great partnership with the PSF thanks to this, to make sure that everything is in place as necessary, to make sure that all associated parts to keeping the maintenance going is there. And basically just trying to make everyone's lives better. Pablo will discuss this more directly in terms of what our most recent change and upcoming exciting experience we're going to have to try to deal with this is. But in general, you can think of this as what can we do to just make everyone's lives better to try to keep the code running. Now, past that, in looking at this overall 5-year horizon, we have a couple of things we would like to see happen, but it needs to be made clear here. We don't dictate the future of the language. We can just provide guidance of what we think should happen. And one of these guiding ideas we would like to see people try to make happen is improving performance. We do hear from people, and we'll discuss this later in our Q&A/AMA section, that people want to see Python perform better. Now, that's actually rather difficult because the language is very old, large code base, there's a lot of backwards compatibility concerns, et cetera, et cetera. It takes a lot of effort to actually bring performance improvements to the language. Now, they do happen almost every release, so it's not to say that we're not making strides, but obviously it'd be nice to make even bigger strides. And there's some trickiness to it that we think as a steering council, we can at least foster to try to help people be able to take the time and effort to try to make performance better. So for instance, trying to help PyPy and other implementations be faster without paying a penalty for trying to be compatible with C extensions is a very good example. And trying to bring people together who do care about performance in ways that they can all work together to try to work with us as a core team and a steering council to try to foster things. Another area that we would like to see foster some growth in community outreach is new platforms. If you ever look at ratings of languages and such, and where they have pros and cons, you often see Python listed with cons of, for instance, mobile and web. Now, we would love to be able to help foster people to come forward with the time and effort to try to make these platforms be more accessible to Python users so that you can use these to actually code apps in Python yourself. There's also an educational aspect due to how many people are on the web and mobile, but I'll discuss that in a later slide. And there's also fostering other fields as well, such as embedded devices, which MicroPython and CircuitPython are currently trying to tackle. But as I just mentioned, education is also part of this. We would love to continue to see education be a focal point of the Python community, as it already is, and try to continue to be the language that educators choose because it's easy to reach and approach and teach to other people. And as part of this, we would like to foster people to come forward and help with the education goals of the overall project. We do have a documentation working group that's being started to help keep the documentation at its high quality and level, which we hope will also help with education. We also want to improve the quality of error messages, which Pablo may touch on later, which is coming out in Python 3.10. But in general, just trying to make the setup easier, working with Python easier, and just make it so that anyone who's coming from a non-technical background to give them the opportunity to start learning with Python and start their coding adventures, as it were. Now, we have some things coming soon over the next year or so, and Pablo's going to be discussing that with you as our illustrious release manager for Python 3.10. Pablo?
Awesome. Thank you, Red. So I would like to start covering first the new improvements that we have in the new release of Python 3.10. As the time we are right now recording this session, Python 3.10 beta 1 actually is going to be released in 1 hour. So I would like to have some time to cover the exciting things that we are going to have in 3.10. Okay, so we have a lot of improvements. Actually, Python 3.10 is one of the releases that pack most stuff together. You can see here some of the things that we have. So we have pattern matching. It's probably one of the big syntactical changes that we have. But we are also packing a lot of things like performance improvements. We have some developments using op-cache ideas that will speed up some operations in the interpreter. We have several improvements actually to the typing languages. We have some deprecation that we are packing. Probably the most important thing is the deprecation of these utils. We have a lot of improvements regarding debugging. I'm going to cover this just in 1 second. And we have also parenthesized context managers that we know that is a feature that many people wanted. So finally, we have it here. Actually, if you look at the list of the PEPs that we have, you will see that we have a lot of PEPs here. I'm not going to cover all of them one by one, but Python 3.10 actually is one of the releases that that has more PEPs included in the Python 3 series, which is quite good. It also is quite difficult to handle all these PEPs together and making sure that we still have a coherent language and good experience for the release. But we think we are doing a good job, and we think Python 3.10 will be a fantastic release, even if we have all these features being added at the same time in the same release. Actually, as I said before, for one of the improvements that we have, and we have heard from people that is quite important, is better error messages. We know that Python is used for a lot of different people and user groups, from professionals to people that are starting to learn. For instance, Python is the official language for teaching in France, if I recall correctly. So having good error message is something that we care, and also in general, better development experience. So Python 3.10 is going to pack a ton of improvements in this area. We have things like better syntax error, better attribute errors that we offer suggestions if you mistype things. We have, as you can see here, it's basically a snippet from the What's New, so you can read more detailed information. But it's important to know that we hear you. We know that this is an area that can use a lot of improvements, and we are starting to work on this slowly. Doing this in a good way is not easy, as many people will know. So you need to be a bit patient, but as I'm very excited to tell you that in this release and the new ones, you will see a lot of improvements in this area. Then something quite important that we are working on right now is the developer in residence. So as you probably may know, handling a project as big as CPython is actually very, very challenging. And there is certain aspects that are very difficult to make it in a way that is efficient and a good experience for everyone. Some things that you may hear of is that we have a huge amount of PRs in the backlog, so they are not reviewed as fast as we want, as many contributors want. We have some problems in the test suite because it's a lot of tests, many architectures that we support. So this is a very challenging thing. So one thing that we have been working with the PSF and with funding from Google, so thank you a lot Google here, is a position what we call developer in residence. And the idea is that we hire a person that we are trying to prioritize core dev, but it's not specifically restricted to core dev, so people can apply as well here. And the idea here is that they can help us with the maintenance of Python. So we need to, because it's the first time we do this, we need to figure out first what is the best way to use the time of the person working on this. But the idea is that it can help on these particular challenging areas. And if this goes well, we certainly hope and we are sure that it will go well. And the idea is then we will extend this position in the future. So we will renew it or we will have more people. It's a particularly tricky aspect, and we are certainly will require work. So be patient with this, but we are quite happy to see for the first time that we can have some pay opportunities. So at the time we are recording, actually, this position is still open, so you can read the requirements and the skills we are looking for, and you probably can apply to it. So we encourage you to do that. The other important thing that, or the other important project that we are working on is the migration from our current issue tracker, which is known as BPO, to GitHub issues. This is actually something that has been, open for a long time. This is actually PEPs 581 and 588. We know also that there hasn't been any big news on this area. So very soon, after the language summit, we are going to have some announcement here, like how the project is going. And we are going to try to make this a bit more transparent in the sense that all the things are going to be on GitHub, so people know what's going on and what issues we have. We have to say that this is actually a bit more challenging than many people think, because it needs synchronization from GitHub and the team working on this. The person leading this is Ezio. So we are working on this. Certainly there is improvements going to make, and there is some announcements that are going to be made soon, but this is happening. Hopefully we'll have it soon, and it's just have some understanding that this is not the easiest thing to do, because Python is a big project, and we need to make sure that when we move all the issues, we guarantee that everyone will have a good experience, ideally better than the one that we have right now. So just be a bit patient, it will happen. Then something that we would like to update here is also like some improvements that we have on the development of CPython itself and the general community here. And what I want to cover here basically is some aspects of things that have been happening or they are happening already. So one of the things that we are doing in CPython is general improvements. So CPython has many different areas of development. It's not only a very big code base, but also it's a big code base that merges two big languages like C and Python. So we've been packing a lot of development improvements here. There is actually some PEPs that try to make sure that the guarantees that we give to the community are a bit better maintained and overlooked. So things like we make sure that the stable C API doesn't break when we do updates. things that there are messages that you saw that actually help us as well develop CPython, because we make a lot of errors as well. So having good errors is quite good. We also try to make Python faster also when it's compiling debug mode, because that's what contributors and core developers run normally. So having a good experience, that is quite good. Bear in mind that this is also not us in the Steering Council working directly on this. This is the improvements that the whole CPython community has been working on, but it's good to summarize here. Then PEPs. So as you saw, Python 3.10 is actually one of the releases that have the most PEPs, and we have quite a big backlog. So we try to go through these PEPs as fast as possible. But it's not the easiest thing to do, in the sense that we want to dedicate a lot of time to every PEP to make sure that we have every possible concern and viewpoint covered. So this is taking a lot. As you saw, probably there is some PEPs that couldn't make it to 3.10. We are trying to work on that. We are trying to also make sure that people have clear expectations over when PEPs will be reviewed, given the big backlog that we have. But there will be a lot of improvements here, hopefully in the next months that we will announce. Then in diversity and inclusion, this is actually a very important thing, because originally the CPython team wasn't the most diverse, but we are certainly working on this. I'm happy to say that this is improvement day after day. And this is quite important. Like, for instance, having members that, and this is just one example, of course, but having some members from Japan or other countries when the language, the written language doesn't use the Occidental characters, have helped us a lot to make decisions over Unicode PEPs and Unicode changes in the interpreter, because they can import some viewpoints over how this is actually used, or what requirements or how the things that we are proposing can fail. So having, a good inclusive and diverse team is fundamental to have, to make sure that the language adapts and is good. It offers the same experience for everyone, no matter what they are doing with Python or the experience level that they have. And finally, productivity is one of the important things that we are trying to improve. We know that developing Python can be quite challenging. We have things like, from the Bible fleet to developing different parts from the standard library to interpreter core. We know that it's quite frustrating when you are working on something and, the system goes in front of you and you cannot do what you want to do very fast. So we're trying to pack here some improvements as well with some automation. So Marietta, for instance, has been working for a long time on bots, and we have more improvements in this area. I've been working, for instance, on automating linking the Bilbo fleet with the GitHub platform, so we can have more immediate ways to test the code and see when something is happening. And we continue doing this thing. And we know that it's an important part of the development experience, and we try to make sense to think about what ways we can actually move this forward. So, and yes, some comments here and something on the general development community. So we are quite excited about the growth of the language. We have seen it grow on many new areas like Asia, Latin America, South Africa, and Africa. And Python obviously has been exploding in things like science and data science, but also on things like education and also in the corporate world. So we are aware of all these different usages of the language. And as the Steering Council, we certainly try to balance all of them, which is quite a challenging task, but we try to make our best. But we are aware of these different things, but also we are seeing a lot of improvements on other areas, like, for instance, Python and web. We have seen recently the development of Python, which is kind of a way of bringing Python to the browser, but also we have seen ways to merge Python and JavaScript in many other ways, like, for instance, the Jupyter Notebook, and all the improvements in that area is one good example, but it's not the only one. So we know that Python is actually still growing quite a lot and quite fast. And there is a lot of different use cases, and this is actually something that makes us very happy. And it's also a good challenge to make sure that all of these things are balanced. But I think it's a very bright future in the next 5 to 10 years. So finally, just as you see, we have been covering like what is the Steering Council, what we do, or how we work normally. You have seen also kind of what is our vision for the like next years, and also the things that we are going to pack soon in Python 3.10, as well as the projects that we are doing, like the GitHub migrations or the developer in residence that we are quite excited about. So we hope that this gives you some good vision over how things are going regarding the Steering Council. And thank you for watching.
Thank you, Pablo. I want to bring up one thing because we apparently all missed this while we reviewed the presentation. In your list of PEPs for 310, you mentioned from future imports annotations, PEP 563 is being accepted, but we actually decided to roll that back because it would turn out to be too disruptive of a change. So just to put minds at ease, if people read that particular list in detail, that is not happening. We didn't, again, change our mind on this. That is not happening.
That would have been a very sneaky way to, to reintroduce that.
And of course, just to be clear, we're not rejecting it. We're just saying we're deferring it to Python 3.11.
Yes, that is what I meant. All right. We had a couple of weeks before we record this, we had a Slido up asking people for questions. We wanted to have a little Q&A session, even though this isn't a live presentation. We didn't get very many responses, but there was some interest. So we have a bunch of questions we're going to try and answer. The first five, including the three most upvoted, all involve performance, which Brett already touched on, but I will try to answer them in one go. They were, when will Python be faster? When will Python get a JIT and just-in-time compiler? What happened with Mark Shannon's proposal for a faster Python? And why does the Steering Council value maintenance more than performance? I think Brett already covered it pretty well, but it doesn't hurt to elaborate a little. First of all, this is all about the CPython implementation of Python, not Python the language, because Python the language is perfectly capable of having a JIT, and there are JITs for Python that are not in CPython. Mark Shannon's proposal wasn't about a JIT, just for the record. It was about other optimizations to CPython, and he didn't make a proposal as such. He was asking about funding for potential work improving it. We don't know any more than anyone else because this all happened on the Python dev mailing list. It was all public. So I don't really have anything to elaborate on there. The problem with performance increases, structural performance increases, is that they are usually a trade-off. They're a trade-off with complexity, compatibility, performance in other cases, like you'll improve one thing and you'll decrease the performance something else, or especially with JITs, things like startup time and memory use, which they frequently impact. So that the wins aren't always obvious. Something that is a performance improvement for one person may be totally unacceptable decrease in performance for someone else. And like I mentioned, there are JITs. PyPy has been around for many years. It is incredibly compatible with CPython, even to the extent of many C extension modules. Not all of them, but many. There are other JIT projects too, Piston, Pigeon, Numba, a whole bunch of others are being worked on. Those are all options that have different trade-offs, and they are usable if you are somehow unable to use PyPy. If you care about a JIT in CPython, you really want to look at these projects and give them a go. And then if they turn out to be generally useful rather than specifically useful, they might end up in CPython, who knows? The Steering Council does care about the performance. We need to have a solid base to build on to. So we need to get our house in order to get rid of our PR backlog, get rid of all the bugs backlog, or a large portion of it, before we can spend the limited amount of funds we have on something like performance. I say that, but if a company would come up with a proposal for significant support to CPython to work on performance projects, then we can find people to work on them. We can extend the developer in residence project to include more people to work specifically on performance. But so far, we haven't heard anyone offering that amount of money yet. Anyone want to add anything to this?
Yeah, small detail. Thanks, Thomas. So something also important to bear in mind is that we continue to have performance improvements on every release on the interpreter. It's just not at the scale that we were discussing with Mark's proposal. Actually, We have a server when we track this, so speed.python.org, and you can see actually that, for instance, Python 3.9 was faster than Python 3.8, and Python 3.10 is again faster than Python 3.9 on some cases, not all across the board, but we have quite a big performance improvement in some places. So it's not that we are not, doing anything on the performance front. There are a lot of core developers that still care about this thing. So stay tuned to foresee more things to come.
I think the other thing I would add is that we are always concerned about performance impact of any new features. So that's definitely something that we talk about in the steering council as we're evaluating PEPs.
All right, next question then.
Okay, so the next question is two questions together, but basically they are about how in the steering council. So basically there is this worry that people have in general about Python getting too big or having too many different areas. Normally they refer to additions to the grammar, right? So the language itself going to these places. So the question is about like what the steering council is doing regarding this thing, or are we caring about like, Python getting too complicated? Or I think one of the other questions was referring to it as Python getting too thin. So certainly we care a lot about this thing. We know that people know Python from being a language that is very easy to work with and very easy to learn. And we know that the more Python grows semantically and syntactically makes this more difficult. We are also aware that Python has many different users. So something that can be very exciting for corporate usage of Python or big code bases may not be that exciting for people teaching Python. So that is something that we are very well aware. And there is not an easy answer in this regard, in the sense that there is not a magical formula. Language design is quite complicated, normally also because it involves a lot of people problem, right? Like understanding. It's not like a formula I can tell you how complex the language is getting, but also is how people perceive the different and complex additions to the language. So when we discuss the different aspects, like for instance, pattern matching recently, this is something that was discussed quite a lot. We certainly make sure to like hear everyone. So we review all the mailing lists and all the discussions, which normally involves like hundreds of mails. So it's task that takes a lot of hours, and we talk with the authors, and we sometimes discuss with some users group. So this is something that we certainly have in mind. So when we accept something that you may think, wow, this is quite big and this is going to make Python, I don't know, super complex language to do. We certainly think that that's not the case for the things we accept. That's almost a tautology because we accepted that. But it's a trust thing, right? Like there is not a magical formula here. There is trade-offs as well. We normally want Python to have and preserve the things that people normally identify with. So certainly the only thing that I can certainly promise is that we hear everyone, and we try to make sure that every point of view is listened to. And we also try to make sure that from a technical point of view, we don't make Python more difficult to parse humanly, right? Like this is something that has come many times in the language changes that have been proposed. We don't know exactly if we are doing the best job at all the areas, but we put our best here. We are also human. So I don't know if someone wants to add something else in this particular area.
Yeah, I had a few things that I wanted to add. One thing that we know is change is something that is going to happen and has happened over the last 30 years of Python. And even if we look back in the last 10 years, the explosion of cloud services and things has really profoundly changed our industry. And when you look at Python, a language, as Pablo said, there are many different use cases. But if you look at Python as an ecosystem, not only is there the language, but there are an abundance of libraries and packages out there on PyPI, CondaForge, and other places. And those are the things that if you're a new user to Python, you're looking at it as, okay, this is complex because of the amount of things. But how do you get past that complexity? You break the problem down. And even though additional features are added into the foundation of the library, doesn't mean that everybody has to learn those or use those out of the gate. And I think one of the things, like Pablo said, is we've spent a lot of time both listening to constructive feedback from the community and months spending time thinking about pattern matching, talking about pattern matching, revising pattern matching. And ultimately, I think what we're doing is positioning Python for the future. And with that, I'm going to perhaps toss it over to anybody else, or if not, Brett, to talk about packaging.
Well, it sounds like no one else had anything to specifically add. So the next question we received was essentially, what are you doing to improve the story of packaging in Python? And somewhat ironically, we're actually the wrong people to ask about that question. So if you're not familiar with packaging in Python, there's kind of two groups. There's the group that's referred to as the PyPA. That's the PyPI /pip /setup tools, virtual nav, that kind of area of packaging. And then there's the Conda group of people on the other side. And in both instances, we actually don't direct or actually control either group. On the PyPA side, we actually have delegated acceptances of PEPs and the actual process of improving packaging to the PyPA itself, so that they can actually work at a faster speed and on their own based on their domain knowledge of packaging. And specifically, when you think about it, Python as a language and CPython as an interpreter don't directly tie into packaging, right? There's not a real one-to-one correlation there. Packaging can actually happen outside of the language and CPython completely independently. And so this is kind of how the structures ended up. Specifically talking from the PyPA side as me, Brett, not specifically as a steering council member, work is being done. There's a lot of kind of convention in packaging that has been slowly teased apart. PyPA, much like core Python, is very much volunteer driven, so there's only so much time and effort people can put in. But there's active work going on to actually try to tease out all the conventions that are in the packaging world into PEPs and into standards. You can see them at packaging.python.org. And then also to take those standards and develop libraries and packages that can actually be reused by other tools, such that there's a lot more code share, and to make it easier potentially for other tools to come forward and flourish and provide better or unique workflows for people that fit their needs better than potentially what the current tools are. So work is very actively happening, but it is actually not being driven by the steering council at all. It is being driven by the PyPA or the Conda groups completely independently on their own, and they are the ones driving it. And for that, I will now hand off to Barry and Carol.
I had a couple more points to make.
Oh, sorry.
The question, I don't remember if we posted the questions anywhere, but the question says, packaging is a mess. And I just want to highlight, if you think packaging is a mess right now, you weren't around 10 years ago or 20 years ago, because it has changed massively in those 20 years, improved enormously in those 20 years, and especially in the last 5 years or so. And the packaging work group and all the people working on PyPI, on pip, on setup tools, they are a showcase of how you can improve an ecosystem and a community such as the Python community if you put in the work. And also, speaking as a PSF director, the amount of money they have been able to pull in by applying for grants and showing that they can do the work has helped us enormously, and also led to the developer in residence position right now, because without the work that they had done in the packaging work group and the work on PyPI, the PSF probably wouldn't have been able to sell the developer in residence position as we have it right now. So really, it is not really a mess. It just requires even more improvement.
I guess if there's nobody else wants to say anything about packaging, the next set of questions are related to sort of the functional areas of sort of how the steering council works. I'll just read a few of the questions. How does one join the steering council? What's the process? What does being in the steering council actually mean? What are your daily, weekly tasks as a steering council member? Did joining the steering council change anything in your career? I'm sure we all have feedback. I'll say The only thing it changed in my career is like I get out of some work meetings, which is awesome. You know, PEP 13 is the governance, sort of the constitution of the steering council, and that outlines how voting happens. You know, you can read that PEP for all the details, but essentially what happens is the elections for the steering council are tied to the annual release process of CPython. So, you know, CPython gets released. There's a period of time in which nominations are open and people can nominate other people. You can nominate yourself. And then once nominations close, there's a period of time in which voting occurs. Core developers are the ones who get to elect the steering council members, but you don't actually have to be a core developer to be on the steering council. As far as sort of like how it works for us, everybody's probably a little different. We meet on Mondays, and I won't say Monday mornings or Monday afternoons because that's different for all of us. But we generally, once we sort of constitute the new edition of the steering council, we find a time that works for everybody. We're currently meeting on Slack. You know, we have a Slack channel that we talk on. And then once we meet, you know, in person, well, sort of in person, you know, over video conferencing for an hour a week. And that's usually when we'll have an agenda. We'll talk about any PEPs that are open. Fortunately, this hasn't been a while. It's been a little while since we've had to do this, but we have had to do this a few times during this steering council, you know, dealing with conduct violations and things like that. That's part of you know, our responsibilities as a steering council. You know, we all do pre-reads of PEPs and we come up with questions and then we discuss those. And sometimes we get to all of our agenda items, and other times we only get to one or two. And then we'll generally go offline to sort of work out how we're going to communicate our decisions. In other words, if we're going to ask PEP authors for more information, we might work on a Google Doc that you know, outlines our questions and requests of those PEP authors. Generally, we'll sort of assign, if it's just an acceptance of a PEP, we'll just assign that, you know, somebody will volunteer to write the acceptance or the rejection notice of a PEP. And that's how we work. I do want to take this opportunity to mention Eva, who from the PSF, who generally joins every one of our meetings and is she's amazing as a person, but also incredibly helpful to the steering council. And it also sort of helps the steering council and the PSF work together in the areas where our interests are overlap. So I think that's kind of all I'll say. I've been speaking for a few minutes, and I'll just open it up to other people and give them a chance to also chime in.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in just briefly. And, you know, unlike writing code and creating, you know, libraries and things like that, the steering council actually serves a very different purpose. And that purpose is to avoid missteps that other communities have had by having weak governance. And by having an articulated governance that we came up with together in PEP 13 and have a process for onboarding new steering council members, for making sure our meetings run smoothly. And I agree with Barry, Eva brings so much to the relationships with the PSF and, you know, as well as, you know, companies that might potentially want to foster future growth of Python. And so if you don't like governance work or, you know, meetings and agendas and that sort of thing, the steering council might not be for you, and go code, do all of that stuff. But if you have an interest in sort of shaping what the core developer community is in terms of its culture, in terms of its direction, then by all means, I encourage you to apply as a steering council member. And does anybody else have anything? Thomas is smiling, so.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. with everything you said.
Was the agreeing?
I was just wondering if it was a subtweet of, certain other communities, but let's not go there.
Well, it is a little timely right now, but I mean, the truth of the matter is we faced a big hurdle when Guido stepped down as BDFL, and I couldn't be more proud of the entire core development community in how we came up with the new governance, how we implemented it, and how it has evolved over the last 3 terms has been really awesome. And I'm just excited to see what happens 5 years from now. But if anybody has some other stuff, please chime in. Otherwise, I will move on to the next question, which should be a very short question. Okay, so the question that got submitted was, will Tkenter ever have official documentation? And the reality is it has official documentation. I'm sure the documentation could be improved, but I don't know of any core developers that are actively working on it. So if you're a community member, remember patches are welcome. Also, we have started a documentation work group, which we will share more details about with the community. The charter is public and there's some messages on Discourse and the mailing lists, but basically what we want to do looking at the next 5 years going forward is how can we improve education at all levels through Python's documentation? How do we increase the productivity of everybody and also deal with the fact that Python is a global language? How do we adapt our documentation to best serve our users? And with that, if folks don't have other stuff, I will turn it over to Pablo.
So the next question is 2 questions together. So it's about contributing to CPython. So one question says, like, how can I better contribute to CPython? I often scroll the backtracker, but most usually stall. I'm waiting for a peer review. And the other question that I merged into this one says, does the C have any plans to address the PR backlog? So actually, as you heard probably like some minutes ago, we have. This is quite a big challenging thing. Like we cannot just magically make disappear 1,500 pull requests, as you may understand. But now with the developer in resident position, we hope that to make this situation better. Not maybe directly addressing all the PRs, like we cannot hire one person which is an expert on all areas of Python that can magically review this thing. Probably will cost more than whatever we're paying for the position. But probably to make sure that we have better processes or better ways for these PRs to get merged and reviewed. Think also that the Python, I mean, this may sound like an excuse, but like, believe me, that is not. Like the CPython core team is quite a very restricted group of people, and CPython has many different things. Like, there is code for many different platforms, many different areas. There is interpreter, the standard library, which is also very big. So it's not only amount of like, there is PRs and nobody's reviewing them. Like maybe what happens is that you are contributing to an area that, maybe it doesn't have a maintainer. So maybe there is a good opportunity to also, search for a maintainer there, or maybe become you the maintainer, like by becoming a core developer. For that, we have the mentorship mailing list, when you can reach to us for if you want to become a core developer, so you can have a mentor. There is kind of a process there, and we are always looking for ways to know which areas of the Python code base need more maintenance and care. For instance, one of the roles that we want this person of the developer in resident positions to investigate is precisely what kind of areas don't get reviews. That happens, and because CPython is that big, isn't very easy to know when that is happening, or because maybe that area, like imagine security, just requires more time because it needs more careful review to those PRs, or because it's the interpreter and it's it's a part that touches a lot of things and it's just a slower process. So understanding these things is something that we want to do, and we are looking for it. We understand that this is challenging still. CPython is a big project and it's an old one, so it's probably not the easiest and best experience to contribute to open source. But we are trying to do our best. And if no one wants to say anything, I think Thomas will do the next question, and Carol.
Yeah, the next question is a little bit of a different question. The original question is, political correctness is good, but can it be overdone? Now, since this is in the Steering Council Q&A, I assume this alludes to one of the things we've done in the last 2 years to do with code of conduct enforcement. We banned a couple of people for shorter or for longer terms, or maybe it is in reference to our decision to rename the master branch domain, following many, many other open source projects that have already done this, or the warning we sent to everyone on Python dev about conduct in core developer spaces following the discussion about master and main. This is one of the areas that are less pleasant to work on as a steering council, but absolutely critical, because we need the developer community to be open and inclusive if we want Python to survive 20, 30, 40 years from now, because people do retire and we need more people. We didn't decide these things out of political correctness as such. We did them because there is a certain community we want to foster, a certain attitude we want to foster. It's an attitude, it's a community we want to work in ourselves, but we also know that it's more open and easier for people to join if the negative interactions are reduced or predictable or easily dealt with. If people can rely on things like code of conduct being enforced. I'm not sure what overdoing it in that sense would look like. We're not losing anything by trying to be inviting or to encourage people to listen to other people. We're not losing anything by asking people to not belittle or ridicule or abuse other people. So that is sort of the extent to what we've done, I believe. Perhaps political correctness could be overdone. I mean, everything can be overdone. You can die from water poisoning by drinking too much water. We're still encouraging people to drink water regularly, and we're not worried about people dying because they drink too much water. I am not going to worry about political correctness being overdone until we're absolutely drowning in positive contributions from every possible source in the world.
Yeah, and I would just like to jump in and say a few things. The Python core development community that I started looking at back in 2014 is very different than the core development community that we have now in 2021. It's not perfect. There's still lots of places to go. And, you know, the PSF's mission is to globally, you know, encourage people to use and contribute to Python. And the term political correctness also often gets tossed about when people say, don't want to directly say, you don't agree with me, so therefore you're wrong. And what I would say to those folks are, look at the people who haven't been included traditionally in the community, who perhaps have been quiet and haven't participated, and take a long look and ask yourself why. Here's a language that can do amazing things in many different spaces in the world. The community should reflect the power of the language and the ability for it to be used by many people. So I'm really proud of the direction the language is going, the core development community is going, and also the opportunities for the future. And I probably should have tossed it over to myself, because the next question, if nobody else has any additions to political correctness, is what would happen to abandon the 3.x version numbering and 1, go to 4.0, or 2, go the Java way, 3.10, 3.11, 3.12, 3.13? Well, first and foremost, I hope we get to 3.14, because then Python could be Pi, and that would be super cool. But in a more serious manner, probably it would be some fundamental change at the CAPI level. perhaps hypothetically adopting HPy entirely and breaking away from the current CPython CAPI, but it would have to be a pretty groundbreaking change for us to want to go to 4.0. And I think Thomas and others might have had some comments on this as well.
Well, I think it's important to clarify. I think Guido mentioned this when he was still BDFL as well. The Python 3.0 migration is not something we want to do again. So if there is going to be a Python 4.0, it will not be like Python 3.0 was after Python 2.6 or 2.7, however you want to look at it. It is never going to be that kind of breaking change again, because it has clearly been a mistake. We're over it now. We even at Google, we're nearly done moving away from Python 2, but we don't want to do it again. So 4.0, it may be like Carol said, a breaking change in the CAPI, but it'll be slow and deliberate, and there will be a good migration path regardless of the reason of a 4.0.
All right. Well, I think that slides into the next question, which I'm tackling. And the question was from Python33, will match case syntax have any performance advantage compared to traditional if-elif chains? I want to answer this in a slightly funny way and not tell you. Now, the reason I'm taking this approach is a very key thing about this pattern matching syntax that is coming in Python 3.10 is it's there to try to make people more productive in certain situations when it's called for. It really shouldn't be viewed as a potential performance improvement. It's meant to be viewed as a potential productivity improvement. So if using pattern matching to do structural checks of something makes more sense than doing a value check, then go ahead and use it. But I wouldn't say that you should be looking at this new syntax from a performance perspective. It really should be viewed more from a readability perspective. And whichever one reads best for your code is the one you should go with. And in general, this is kind of the approach that we take when we make decisions. Without specifically speaking for everyone, we view Python's goal as trying to make you as productive as possible as a developer. And that ranges from both as a brand new person in education to a very seasoned person who's been doing this for decades. And there are various trade-offs and various ways to do that. And we try to balance it so that everyone is at a good place. But that means that we're not trying to optimize for performance up front when we make syntactic decisions like this. As we've said multiple times in this presentation, we definitely want to see performance continue to improve, but we're not trying to introduce syntactic changes specifically just to try to optimize if and elif, for instance. This was very much specifically done to try to optimize your ability to be productive.
Also, now that Brett cannot hear us, no, it's not faster. It needs to check all the branches, at least in the first implementation.
I guess I'll take the next question, and I'll try to do this quickly. The question is, will Python ever have static typing? And I guess I'll answer what I think the implicit question is, which is, will Python ever require static type annotations? And I think the answer, well, I know the answer is going to be no. Like, none of us want to see that required. What I think is interesting is that, you know, personally, I was pretty against static type annotations way early on. And it's something that I've really come around to, especially in use cases where in a corporate environment where you have tons and tons of code and lots of new people coming in and coming out, and you want to get them onboarded onto a particular code base very quickly. I've also found it very useful for my own libraries that I maintain. It's a great documentation tool. But I also will always appreciate my the first time I saw Python code, and it was just like from brain to fingers and working code so quickly and easily, whereas other languages have a lot of boilerplate and things like that. So we want to preserve this notion, and I think it's actually worked for Python pretty well, where you can add type annotations if you want. You don't have to. You can just write Python code as, with dynamic typing as we've always done, and it's perfectly great. So I think that's going to be, that's where Python will always live, in that sort of sweet spot of optional static typing. Anybody else want to bring that up? Okay, I'll go with the next one. With this utils officially on the deprecation track, will TOML be brought into the standard library, or will future packaging forever be based on multiple base recs? And the short answer is, we don't know. Nobody's come to us and asked us formally to add TOML support to the standard library. So, we're generally a reactive governing body, and so we don't have anything to react to.
Formal is the key here. So nobody says that they have not rant about this in Twitter. We are aware of the rants. The formally is the key here.
Now everybody's going to go out and write a PEP. I can just see it now.
So to put some very specific topical information on this. So as the person who helped bring TOML to Python packaging as one of the co-authors of PEP 518, I was actually planning to bring TOML formally forward for inclusion, but due to time constraints that I personally had in trying to get things done for Python 3.10, both as a steering council member and as a core developer, I wasn't able to do so. But it's also led to me trying to kick off a discussion that we'll be having at the Language Summit, or at least that I'm going to try to cause to have at the Language Summit, about what the future of the standard library is. Because one of the funny things here with TOML is I've seen people come to me saying, when's TOML being added? Does that mean that Python is not, as a language and as a community, not taken to the new approach and directions of packaging seriously? And the answer is no, not at all. As I've said earlier, when I answered the question about packaging is handled by a separate group. They don't directly answer to us, and we don't tell them what to do. And so it's not a, hey, we want TOML in the standard library, add it. And it's not the other way around, where we say, here's the configuration language to use for packaging. So as everyone has said, no one's brought it forward officially, partially because no one's being told, but that doesn't mean it's not viewed as official or the way forward for the packaging world. I do have plans to eventually bring it forward. There is a larger discussion, though, I think that we need to have as a development team of what we want the standard library to be, because we've actually never had that discussion. It's going to be a very involved discussion. It might be a very long discussion. But eventually, once that discussion is had and we, as a group, have decided what we want the future of the standard library to be and its themes and et cetera, I will personally make sure that if bringing TOML into the standard library makes sense based on that outcome of that discussion, it will be brought forward. Just no promises of ETA.
And with that, I think we're about out of time. We had a couple of more questions, but they were not that interesting. And if people are worried, I'll probably post an answer to them on Twitter, just to close the loop for the people who asked those questions. Anyone have any other last thoughts? Well, in that case, thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Carol. Go ahead.
I was just going to thank everybody, and in particular, the core developers, the rest of the steering council, Eva and the folks at the PSF who have supported us, and most of all, the many users around the world, the people who are running user groups, meetups, conferences. You are building the future of Python one step at a time. So thank you for that.
I'll just echo Carol. Like, Python is your language and Python is your community. So get involved. No matter what area is interesting to you. If you're a C programmer or you're not a C programmer, it doesn't matter. If you like to write documentation, please come and help. There are so many interesting things to be involved in Python, and I encourage every single one of you to get involved in whatever way satisfies you.
Couldn't agree more. I just hope we get to see everyone in person next year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At least the people who want to travel to PyCon US, because that is something I've really missed in the last year and a half.
Yeah.
And thank you for watching. And I hope you all enjoy PyCon for the next couple of days.